Christ did not come to be adored. He was a prototype. He came to be imitated. This is what you can do when you realize who you are. You have to develop Christ consciousness. You have to be loving beings. You have to be like the Buddha. There is no other way.
A lot of spiritual communities and a lot of spiritual teachers are so serious. We've fictionalized a very serious Jesus, which is a problem. And when people ask, if you could podcast with anybody, who would it be? Like, of course, Jesus. Because I want to see how he laughs. I want to see what his love life was like. I want to know what happened when he drank too much wine. Of course, he must have been laughing all the time.
Absolutely. When I write Catholic, I write it with a small c, because I know that every single one of us is a child of the universe. Sin is the individual transgression of a culturally created precept, whereas evil is a cosmic conspiracy using human intermediaries to separate souls from source.
Merlin, as I understand it, was not one person, but was a title of a wizard.
The mythology says that they were actually refugees from Atlantis. There were these mythical characters with this extraordinary technology, not necessarily machine technology, but mental intuition, prophecy, clairvoyance, clairaudience, clairsentience, psychokinesis. So in many senses, they were magicians. And they became what was known afterwards as the fairy folk or the leprechauns, deeply, mystically spiritual people who were in love with life and with Gaia. And there are gazillions of souls that I want to be on planet Earth. I want to be on planet Earth. That's your job. Become part of the group who are warriors on the way. Find the other light workers and join with them. That's your function.
Father Sean O'Leary is a genuine Catholic mystic. And if that sounds like a paradox to you, it did to me as well, until I met him, until I read his book, Setting God Free, because his relationship to the divine, to the God of all that is, his relationship to the teachings of Yeshua, his understanding both from a felt perspective and a learned perspective, his mind and his ability to interpret and understand some of these incredible teachings that offer guidance for our lives is really unparalleled. So it is with absolute delight that I introduce Father Sean O'Leary. Sean, it's great to be here. Do you still consider yourself a Catholic?
I do.
You do?
With a capital C, with a small c. Not a Roman Catholic as in affiliated with an organization, but Catholic as in universal. And so I know that one of the things I say to my community every Sunday, I say Mass right in this room here, this space. I have an altar I bring out. And one of the things I say to them is, every one of you is a priest. Your ordination was your volunteering for Reincarnation. And therefore, if you have the elements in your home, bread and wine, I want you now to offer it, to consecrate it, and to consume it. So to create a Eucharist in your own home. So I think that everybody is a priest. And so for me, being Catholic is with a small c, it's universal. So it didn't make any sense to me that you could say Roman Catholic. It's like Roman is a kind of a little squashed version, and Catholic means universal. So they write it with RC capitals. So when I write Catholic, I write it with a small c, because I know that every single one of us is a child of the universe. I say, in fact, that, ultimately, life is a dream that the ego is having. And the ego is a dream that the soul is having. And the soul is a dream that spirit is having. And spirit is a dream that source is having. So basically, we're God's dream. There is only God. Everything that exists is God in drag. And so we're literally just, the ways in which God experiences. And so we can't not be Catholic in our ministry. If we try to be less than Catholic in our ministry, we don't understand ourselves, and we don't understand our mission, and we don't understand God.
What does the word Catholic actually mean?
Yeah, it means universal.
Universal?
Yeah, that's what it means.
From what language?
From Latin.
Uh-huh. So you say God is all that is.
Yes.
God is.
Yeah.
And then I think there's some confusion that arises because we see things and we say, that can't be God.
Yes.
Torture,
Yes.
child abuse, rape.
Yes.
That's not God.
Yes.
How is that God? How have you reconciled that fundamental existential problem?
I think that's a great problem. It's called the theodicy problem in theology. Why do bad things happen to good people, whereas they're evil in the world? And I've a fairly complex theory of evil. So I've been recording my dreams since 1979. And I seed my dreams. So I go to bed at night and I have an idea. I want some kind of an input on this issue that I'm wrestling with. So about 2 years ago, before I went to sleep, I said, I want to be able to distinguish between sin and evil. I woke up at 4 o'clock in the morning, and in my mind I heard this, sin is the individual transgression of a culturally created precept. It's just breaking a human-made law. Whereas evil is a cosmic conspiracy using human intermediaries to separate souls from source. And so, in some senses, that's one aspect of evil. That when God creates holographic fractals of herself, so that I had this vision in September, just gone by last year. I had a fever. I had COVID, and whenever I get a fever, I have these visions. So when I was in Kenya, I got malaria at least once a year, and I'd have these extraordinary visions because of the fever.
Did you go out looking for mosquitoes so you could have better visions?
When things were going slow.
Mosquito waska for you? Yeah.
Yeah. And so this last September, I had a COVID, and I had this extraordinary vision that originally there is only God, there is only source. But if there is only God, experiences are impossible. If there's nothing except God, God cannot experience. And so God self-fractures. And you've got the beautiful term in Hebrew for this, it's called netzotzim, where God kind of divides herself up into these kind of fires or flames of the self. So in this vision, I could see that was the first act of manifestation. Now again, I don't believe in creation in the sense that creation, creatio ex nihilo, means God creates stuff out of nothing. So God goes into his workshop on a Monday and creates elephants, and he goes in on a Tuesday and creates mosquitoes. I don't believe that. I believe rather what Plotinus said, I don't believe in creatio ex nihilo. I don't believe in creation out of nothing. I believe in emanatio ab Deo, emanation from source, that everything that exists is actually a manifestation. It's like when I look at a tulip or a daffodil in the ground, there's this big ugly bulb, and then this green stalk comes up, and then this beautiful flower. So did the bulb create the stalk? No. Did the stalk create the flower? No. The essence of the bulb was to manifest at some stage as a stalk and eventually as a flower. So everything that exists is a manifestation of source. So that was the first thing I saw. Next thing I saw was these souls came into conference with God, with source, and said, let's do something fun. So the first project is, let's create a cosmos. So together with God, these fractals, these netzotzim, created the cosmos. And they're in awe of what they just created. And it's like the Buddhist notion of turiya, the witnessing consciousness. You're just watching this extraordinary creation, but you're not identified with it. And then there was a second conference that said, what would happen, if we could insert ourselves into the cosmos, if we could become living beings and experience it not as kind of observers from the outside, but as participants from the inside? It's what cultural anthropology will call participant observer. And Buddhism will call turiyatita, the ability to walk as a witness and also as a participant. I don't identify with the participant, but I'm doing the best I can as a participant. And so what I see then, in some senses, God decided to kind of indulge us and let us kind of have fun with our creativity. But at some stage, we built free will into the equation. Now, there's a big difference for me between free will and freedom. Free will is the ability to do as I please. Freedom is the ability to do as pleases God. Because freedom is the ability to always choose the loving, compassionate thing. And free will is to indulge, my own baser instincts if I want. So once free will is built into the equation, then we can choose to be selfish, greedy, violent, or whatever. And God says, okay, if that's what you want to experience, okay, see where it takes you, what happens. So in December 2012, I was down at the creek down here, Pina Creek. I go down there, Lawakela. And I go down there, and there's a guy sitting on the banks of the river. I've never seen anybody down there in 30 years. And I knew I was having an astral encounter with him. And he's sitting on the banks of the river with his feet dangling in, and he's chewing on a blade of grass, like an old hillbilly, from whatever, Ohio or someplace. And so I sit beside him, dangle my feet in the river, pluck a blade of grass, start chewing on it. And in my mind, I say to him, I wonder if he's going to tell me a story. And he turned to me, and without ever opening his mouth, mind to mind, he said, yeah, I will tell you a story. And he told me the following story. He said, I travel throughout the universe, and my function is to seed life. And I've done it many, 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 many times. And we seed it, we water it, we weed it, we genetically modify it, and I can predict very accurately how every kind of planet is going to evolve until we build free will into the equation. And then all bets are off. At that stage, I can't predict where it's going to go. Because at that stage, we're on a spectrum between, I call it A Street and B Street. A Street is kind of self-indulgence and service to the self, complete service to the self. And we have to start there. Every little infant is a total narcissist. Otherwise, they wouldn't survive infancy. I need mother's breast. I need cuddling. I need warmth. I need conversation. But at some stage, we're supposed to move from service to self into service to other. The Mother Teresa's of the world, the Buddhas of the world, or the Jesus Christ of the world. But most of us get stuck, to service to self. And so when I'm stuck at that stage, I'm selfish, I'm self-engrossed, I'm envious of people who have what I want and I don't have it. And then I get greedy, and then I get avaricious, then I get angry, then I get violent, and then I start wars of various kinds. And now all the shit that we see in the world is because we refuse to move to compassion. And so for me, it's the question of, am I exercising my free will to make choices that move me into freedom? Or am I simply exercising my free will in order to kind of aggrandize myself? And this is true not just of individual people, it's true of entire cultures, or it's true of, organizations, like a religious group or an economic model or an educational system. And so the temptation always is, to kind of treat everything else and everybody else as merely resources, to be kind of exploited in some way. So that's one piece of it. Another piece of the problem for me is this, that there's a great astrophysicist called, what was his name? Nikolai Kardashev. You come across his work. He talked about typologies of civilization in the universe. And he identified 3 types. Now, I think actually there are 5 types. And he said a type 1 civilization is a civilization that's able to harvest its own planet, organically and ecologically to meet its own needs. So it can harvest the wind, the waves, volcanoes, tidal waves, hurricanes, all these, to meet its own energy needs. A type 2 is a civilization that can do that for its entire solar system. So if it were us, we'd be harvesting the sun, Jupiter, Pluto, etc., to meet our needs on Earth. But we would do it kind of ecologically. And a type 3 civilization is a civilization that can do that for an entire galaxy. Now, I think actually there are 2 more versions. I think there's a cosmic one, and I think there's a multiple universes that can harvest it. Now, imagine a very advanced civilization that's a type 3 with extraordinary technology, both mechanical and kind of mental technologies. But they're at the narcissistic stage of their own spiritual evolution, because scientific evolution does not necessarily mean moral kind of evolution. So if we had beings like that, they would regard us perhaps as just fodder. So I think that part of it is that there are beings out there who are technologically advanced, but they're feeding off human distress. In the same way that, get people having dogs fight each other and people putting bets in it, and murder the bastard. So they're literally feeding energetically off the distress of these 2 animals that are savaging each other. And that there may well be beings out there, advanced beings, who are feeding off the distress of human beings. So they foment wars and distress of all kinds. So that would be a second ingredient. A third ingredient for me would be, if you believe in evolution, and I'm not really convinced in Darwinian evolution, I believe in adaptation, but not that, that eventually a single cell morphs into a human being and become a dinosaur, and a mammal in the process. I think there's adaptation within species to changing circumstances. And so if you think, for instance, then in the evolutionary trajectory, if you buy into the Darwinian mode, then we've descended from apes. And you look at apes and chimps and whatever, and you look at their behavior, and they're extremely territorial, and they're really, really vicious and violent, and they murder each other. Different groups murder each other. So if there's some of that in our DNA, so that would be a third factor. So I look at the problem of evil then, and for me it's a multifactorial equation. I need to understand then, if given the gift of free will, do I also have the insight that I need to move from service to self to service to others, from kind of self-will to compassion, from free will to freedom. So that's part of the kind of equation for me. Yeah.
There's so much to talk about there. Let's back up to the man by the river. This was, if you reached out and touched him, he would have actually had flesh?
No.
No. So you just saw him in the vision
at the
space.
astral level.
In
It's
the
like
astral level.
a dream of the night. Within the dream, you're interacting with the other denizens of the dream, and they seem to be fleshly, and they're talking to you, whatever. But you know that it's being created at a different level of the kind of the spiritual hierarchy. But it's really real in the dream. Now, a vision for me, as I said in that piece I wrote, in the Hebrew language, dream and vision are synonyms. A dream is a vision you have when you're asleep, and a vision is a dream you're having when you're awake. And in the Hebrew scriptures, they're kind of interchangeable. So when you have Jacob having a dream, and then you have the angels ascending and descending on the ladder, that's a vision he had when he was asleep. But then you have other people, and they're wide awake, and they're having visionary experiences. It would be like Isaiah in the temple, 742 BCE. And so for me, they're totally interchangeable. And one is no less real than the other. It's just a question of the densification of the experience. Is it a 3D kind of dense kind of encounter, or is it a 5D kind of encounter where it's an astral reality, which is even more real than the physical, but not fleshly in any way?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
The shamans in Peru, who I've studied with and work with, they have a similar model where dreams, visions, and reality are all the same thing. So they could be telling you a story. I saw a jaguar, and whether they saw an actual jaguar, they dreamed of a jaguar, or they had a vision of a jaguar, it's the same thing to them. They really don't distinguish it. So it gets very confusing when people try to ask them these questions, because they just speak it as it was. What was the first time you had an open-eyed vision like that in your life?
Yeah. Well, I had a lot of them when I was in Kenya because of when I got malaria and I did these altered states of consciousness. And so I remember at one stage I was really, really sick. I lived in very remote areas on my own. And I thought I had malaria, and I was treating myself for malaria, but I wasn't getting better. And I hadn't seen another, missionary for 3 or 4 months. And I'm lying in my bed, and I think I'm dying. And my body is all shivering with the fever and whatever. My mind is racing. And all of a sudden I hear this voice in my head, crystal clear. And it said, your body is doing what bodies are built to do, but you're not your body. Your emotions are doing what your emotions are built to do, but you're not your emotions. And your mind is doing what minds are built to do, but you're not your emotions. And all of a sudden there's this extraordinary calm at the interiority. Now I'm still shivering with the fever, but there's this really, really, really calm place within me. And so that voice was absolutely real. So was it a vision? Was it a dream? Was it a fever? Was it a hallucination? They're all just different ways of processing, articulating, or kind of identifying a divine encounter. And I've had the privilege then subsequently of attending many people who are dying, including my own mother in 2010. And one of the things I always say to them is, your body is doing what bodies are built to do, but you're not your body. Your mind is doing what minds are built to do, you're not your mind. Your emotions are doing what emotions are built to do, you're not your emotions. And I keep repeating that to them again and again and again. I keep saying, no, watch for the light, go towards the light. Go to your grandmother, your mother, or whatever it is, look out for her, she's coming for you. There are angelic beings coming to attend you. Forget about the other stuff. That is not who you are. So don't identify with that, and don't get distracted by that. So all of those, for me, you can say they're visionary experiences, you could say they're hallucinations due to the kind of the malaria, or you could say that they're kind of, that they're dreams I had and I was in and out of sleep. But for me, they're no less real than you and I speaking right now and articulating with English kind of words.
Reminds me of, I believe in Doors of Perception, Aldous Huxley wrote about the flagellists who would whip themselves with whips on their back, and their backs would start to bleed, and then the cuts would get infected, and then they would get fevers, and then they would have mystical experiences from this. So you could look at it as, and in some ways it is a barbaric practice. They were punishing themselves for this idea of original sin that had been transplanted into them as a mechanism of control, something that, as made you excommunicado from the Catholic, the proper Catholic Church is your explication of these ideas. But he identified that there was actually a mystical impulse that actually came from this, that this brought them into a state of natural reverie, much like the Sundance rituals of our First Nations
hanging people up.
Yeah. The piercings and the fasting and the sweating and the dancing in the sun until you pull the plugs from your flesh.
Right. That's beautiful. So, I mean, I think anything that allows us to temporarily disidentify with our physicality, temporarily, offers the opportunity of going to hell or going into heaven, And the thing about hell is, can you harvest the hell experience? There's this very strange statement in one of the Christian creeds where it says that when Jesus was in the tomb, he descended into hell. So not only was he able to kind of, in some senses, renounce his divinity, as all of us have done, and become a human being, and kind of harvest tree density, and find out, can I remember who I am, even in this dense spacesuit? Can I remember that I'm a son of God, as everybody is? But he went even further. He went down into the hellholes. It's like, let me experience what it's like to feel totally alienated from God and totally powerless. Could I manage to go down there and still remember that I'm a child of God? And so for me, that any form of pain, no matter how excruciating, can be harvested for the realization that, we're literally bite-sized pieces of God who volunteered for reincarnation. Can we remember that? And can we harvest that? And can we actually bring light out of that? And can we then develop compassion? Because now we're experiencing extraordinary pain, and there's other people throughout the world who have no choice over the matter. Now, can I do that on their behalf as well? So I remember in 1996, I was invited by the Presbyterian Church in Palo Alto to give a series of lectures during Lent, 7 lectures once a week for Lent. And I titled the whole series, Will the Real Jesus Please Stand Up? And I'm kind of preparing for these talks. And I had this really powerful vision, and Jesus was in the room with me. And I had been reading this passage where Jesus says in John's Gospel, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Nobody comes to the Father except through me. And I said to him, did you say that? And he said, yes, I did. Because the way is love, and the truth is love, and the life is love. There is no way to the Father except through love. And then he spontaneously said, and the Buddha is the way, the truth, and the life, because the Buddha is compassion. You can't get to the Father except through compassion. And so he wasn't claiming that I, Jesus of Nazareth, am the only way in which people can be saved. He was saying you have to develop Christ consciousness, and that, you have to be loving beings. You have to be like the Buddha. You have to be compassionate beings. There is no other way to access your inner divinity except, making this the way, making this your truth, and making this your life purpose.
So much suffering, so much war would have been changed if Jesus could stand up and be in a room and clear up that whole clear up that whole mess, because everybody's been saying my God in this ethnocentric frame, and then we've been going to war and committing atrocities because of it all the time. But I want to back up a little bit. We maybe get back to that thread. I want to talk about hell a little bit. I'm 25 years as a psychonaut. So I've experienced the great plant medicine traditions of the world and innovated my own traditions as well. And recently I had one of the strongest hell experiences I've ever had, which led to one of the most powerful revelations I've ever had. In this experience, I was disassociated from my body to such an extent into another dimensional reality where the only thing in that dimension was energy, geometry, and frequency.
Wow.
So there was no other beings, but I brought my consciousness with me. So there was a feeling of being totally alone.
Gotcha.
Lavado, like completely alone and isolated. And that was hell. And I had to anchor back to my breath. I had enough consciousness to avoid the panic of being in that place, feeling like I broke the simulation, right? Like, oh no, I did it. I broke it and I'm going to be stuck here forever. But I just connected to my breath and waited for my body to return and come back. And as my body came back, I was filled with this most overwhelming sense of gratitude and love and joy for the fact that I am.
Yes. And
It is. I just wanted to scream. Like, it is God. It is. And it's so beautiful. And it reminds me of like how you can harvest from that, from the hell experience, which fortunately, blessedly, I was able to do. And still there's a little bit of that hell that I haven't metabolized that kind of came from that experience.
That's extraordinary, Aubrey. I can well imagine it. I mean, in some senses, you did a kind of a Christ consciousness dive into the deepest, darkest, densest separation from source, and still remembered who you were. and clawed your way back out of it, by kind of touching into the love that was at you.
Mm-hmm.
So there's this, Christ is kind of he's the real expert at the paradox and the kind of non sequiturs. There's this great story, and of course he's always speaking in parables because he realizes that he's not appealing to your mind, he's appealing to your heart and to your soul. And he tells this great story about a very rich man who had a steward whom he put in charge of all his property. And he found out after a few years that this guy was embezzling his property. So he calls an accountant. He says, I want to see the books. I believe that you've been embezzling my property. And the guy says, holy shit, what am I going to do now? I'm too old to get a real job. I'm too embarrassed to beg. What am I going to do? So he starts calling in his master's debtors. And he says to Michael, how much do you owe my master? 50 gallons of wine. Here's your bill, make it 30. Mary, how much do you owe my master? 100 bushels of wheat. Here's your bill, make it 80. And so he's going to go out afterwards. Now he's going to get fired. He's going to say, bakshishi, And Jesus said a very strange thing. He said, the master praised the unjust steward insofar as he had acted wisely, because the children of this generation are wiser to their kind than the children of light. Now, was he praising this guy's duplicity? Absolutely not. He was saying, here's a guy who could turn every situation to his own economic advantage. When he was a steward, he was embezzling. When he got fired, he was taking the bakshishi, the bribe, the people whose bills he'd cut down. And Christ says, why can't you guys do that? Why can't you harvest every situation in your life, every experience of your life, every relationship in your life, and harvest for your own spiritual evolution? These guys can do it around money. Why can't you do it around light? So it's exactly what you did. It's like you took this utter darkness and you harvested it. I mean, hats off to you, bro, that you could do that. That you had the kind of, that center of you, that divine within you was so totally grounded that you still had access to it in spite of the circumstances of being utterly alone and in the dark. Mazel tov.
It's because I have so much love.
Brilliant.
So much love. I was loved so much by my mother and my grandmother, and I'm loved so much by my beloveds, and I love life so much, and then the synonyms: love, truth, God, beauty, all the values, all the virtues, all creation, like they're all really synonyms, and we get to live in this experience of God. And then there's the force of delusion, distortion, anti-life, which doesn't go all the way up. In my cosmology, it doesn't go all the way up and all the way down. Yeah. It's limited to a dimensional purview, a band in the middle. But it's very real, and it can fuck us up. I've named that force anti-you.
Oh, okay.
It's a force of negation and resistance to our evolution. But at the divine highest perspective, thank you for the opponent.
Yes.
Thank you for the sparring partner. Right. Thank you for the training mate that allows me to actually sharpen the sword of my soul.
Exactly. Beautiful. That's beautiful. I totally agree with you. There is that band in between. And the question is, can we navigate that band successfully? Can we remember where we came from, what we volunteered for? And would that kind of support us in our journeys through the darkness and the self-doubt? Mm-hmm. Beautiful.
What's been your most harrowing experience with the darkness, the devil, perhaps? And what are your thoughts on the quote, the devil?
So, I think in some senses that there's this great notion in Buddhism called the tulpa. The tulpa. Mm-hmm. That the tulpa is the kind of the personification of an energy form. And so when I have kind of selfish thoughts or evil thoughts of various kinds, I'm literally creating an energetic form.
Right.
There's this, and so I think we do that as individuals. I think we do it as cultures. I think we do it as a global community, as a human species. And then because I'm not processing that at an individual level, I'm going to have to project it onto somebody. So if I project it onto you, I'm going to be mad at you for shit that I'm doing myself. If I do it, as a culture, I'm going to project it onto some other culture. If we do this as human beings, we're going to project it onto nature. And so it's like this great, the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, all the plastic. Yeah, set in the middle of the Pacific. And so it's all the crap that's being dumped off ships in the sea and the west coast of the United States and the east coast of Asia. And because of the gyroscopic nature of the tide, this huge big island is the size of Texas. Now, that's all projected material from human lifestyle. Now, I think we create the same thing, at a tulpa level. that rejected, energies where I'm not dealing with my own shadow material. I'm going to have to project it onto somebody else or onto another culture, and that constellates and it is a real energy form. For me, in some senses, then that's Satan or that's the evil, but it has an energy, and in some senses, it has a personality and it has a kind of a plan. How do we suck more people into this darkness? So this is the kind
because it feels like it wants to grow.
Absolutely.
As all energy forms, as all entities do.
Absolutely.
As we projected it, then it forms into this life form,
Right.
and then it wants to grow.
It has cosmic pretensions. It literally has cosmic pretensions. It wants to gobble up everything.
Yeah.
And so that's the job then of the light workers, of the Archangel Michaels of the world. The people who are coming awake, and stop, let me start with myself and stop projecting my shit onto other people, deal with it myself. And then kind of be part of a community that's acknowledging whatever kind of shadow material we have as a community. And the interesting thing to me is, with Carl Jung said that the shadow is 80% gold. It's 80% unrealized potential. So instead of kind of adoring these characters we see on television and wanting to be like them, so I want to be a basketball player like you, but I'm sitting on the sofa eating, Cheerios and drinking Coca-Cola, and developing a huge big belly. Rather than kind of imitating you, I'm just admiring you from a distance and getting bigger and fatter and more obese. And so it's 80% gold, 80% unrealized potential that we're not activating, and it's 20% repressed traumata. And so getting into the shadow material is actually finding a gold mine and literally mining it for the potential that exists there. But you have to be able to risk meeting the darkness as well, and wondering, what are you going to do with the darkness? So to answer your question directly, on 2 occasions when I was in Kenya, and on each of the occasions, I was leading a retreat for another group of priests. And I lived in temperatures 122, so we'd all take a siesta in the afternoon. So on each occasion, and they were years apart, I had this experience. Some part of me woke up, and for I don't know how long, I didn't know who I was, I didn't know what I was, I didn't know where I was, or I didn't know when I was. There's this just total blackness with only this tiny splink of consciousness, but I couldn't even identify what there was no me. There was no now, there was no when, there was no where, there was no person. And I'm freaking out. Whatever part of me still is freaking out. How the hell do I get out of this space? And eventually it resolved itself. And about 2 or 3 years later, I had the very same experience with the same outcome. And at the end of that one, I said, if this ever happens again, I'm going to just stay in the darkness and let's see what happens with it. And it happened again a 3rd time. And I don't know how long I was in it. It could have been seconds, it could have been an hour, I have no idea. But at some stage, I realized I was just pure awareness with no content whatsoever. There wasn't a Sean, there wasn't a time, there wasn't in Kenya, there wasn't a place called Kenya anymore. So there was just pure awareness. So basically, the totally kind of witnessing consciousness, and I managed to survive through that. And it feels to me very like what you just described a few minutes ago.
Sounds so much like
in that space.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It seems to me that so many people are so busy fighting this darkness externally, but the greatest access point, the purchase that we have on these energies is within. And if we actually just focus within, there's so much, all of that gold, when that gold alchemizes into the manifest potential of who we are, when we become, imitatio Christi, like we actually walk the way of Christ and awaken our Christ potential, so much potential. And all the parasites that are feeding on this unutilized quantum potential of all the light and all the love we have are just blown out and no longer sucking our life force. And we become like a radiant sun that's able to shed and spread that, but it goes within. Instead of trying to take little flashlights and shine them on every little dark corner, you'd be there your whole life.
Absolutely.
There's darkness everywhere, but if we take those lights and shine them inside, there's so much potential.
Absolutely. Beautifully said, Aubrey. And so I talk sometimes about what I call the 5 L's, love, light, logos, life, and laughter. And for me, the procession goes like this, that ultimately there is only love. And if I were to kind of define love, I would say that love is the divine womb in which embryonic Christ consciousness is marinated, in the amniotic fluid of God's self. And so there is only love. Now, I think love births twins. It births light and it births logos. And light, we know from quantum mechanics, all matter is frozen light. So everything that exists in the material world is actually frozen light. But then you need to give it form and shape. So the logos is the kind of morphological agent that kind of creates form from matter. So it's like the potter at the wheel who's taking just mud, and is fashioning it into a bowl or a cup or whatever. And so logos is the morphological agent that turns light into a form. And then they dance together and they create life. When you bring, when you create the form out of the light, then you're dealing with the life itself. And the objective of light then is to learn how to laugh. The first sign of enlightenment is laughter. And I don't mean a disrespectful, sneering laugh at somebody else. I mean the laughter at the realization, holy shit, I've been living in an illusion all my life. And now I'm beginning to see and break out of the bubble. And I'm just delighted. And then I'm laughing at others, not because I'm taking delight in the fact that they're asleep, but that they're waking up. Like if you're the father of an 8-month-old baby and is learning to stand up and he falls on his tush and he gets up again and he falls on his tush, and you're the father and you're delighted and you're laughing. Not at his distress, but at, my God, he's going to learn to stand and walk, and run. And so for me, I call them the 5 L's. We start with love. That generates light and logos. Together they generate life. And the object of life is to learn how to laugh. Yeah.
I've always said for many, many years that you can tell a spiritual master by the sound of their laughter. Like really, it's the clearest sign. And it's one of the critiques that I have. A lot of spiritual communities and a lot of spiritual teachers are so serious. Yeah. And I think we've fictionalized a very serious Jesus also, which is a problem. And when people ask, if you could podcast with anybody, who would it be? Like, that's the silliest question ever. Of course, Jesus. Of course. Because I want to see how he laughs.
Absolutely.
I want to see what his love life was like. Absolutely. I want to know. Yeah. I want to know what happened when he drank too much wine. I want to know what this was like. And I think we've missed a whole lot by actually freezing him in this very serious frame. Of course, he must have been laughing all the time.
Absolutely. There's one famous portrait actually of him coming out of the Jordan, having been baptized by John the Baptist, and he's cracking up. His big belly up, his mouth is wide open. I don't know who did the painting, but it's absolutely brilliant that he got it. Like, finally, even Jesus was able to crack the last illusion under which he lived. And he had some illusions. There was times when he kind of put his foot in it. One of my favorite stories is, it's in Matthew's Gospel, it's the story of the Syrophoenician woman. He's exhausted, from traveling all around Israel and preaching nonstop. And he says to the guys, let's get out of here. Let's take a break. And they're going to Syrophoenicia, which is north of Israel. And he's walking through a village, and a woman recognizes him. She'd been in Israel, and she says, I recognize this guy. He's the wonder worker. And she runs after him. She says, Son of David, have pity on me. My little daughter's at home, and she's deadly ill. Please come and heal her. And Christ says a very strange thing. He says, I was only sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And she says, no, my little child is dying. Please have pity. And he says, I can't take the food from the children and throw it to the dogs. And I think the father gave him upside the head, whapped him upside the head, and said, there are no dogs. I don't create dogs in that sense of the word. And the woman came back to Christ and says, maybe, you know what? Maybe I'm a dog. But you know what? Sometimes crumbs fall from the master's table and the dogs come and eat them. That's all I want. Some crumbs. And Christ says, I've never found any faith like this in Israel. He says, go home, your daughter is fine. But it's like Christ had to learn to deal with the prejudice at that stage. Yeah? So he's a work in progress, as are we all. And so one by one, he had to look into his shadow material and deal with that and grow through that. Yeah.
Why else would he spend 40 days in the desert?
Exactly.
Grappling with his own darkness.
Exactly.
If he was already came out as a fully baked cake.
Yeah. If he did, he couldn't have been an example for us.
Yes.
And the mistake that the churches make, the Christian churches make, is that they think Jesus is the only Son of God meant to be adored. Christ did not come to be adored. He was a prototype. He came to be imitated. This is what you can do when you realize who you are, and this was the message, be who you are. So I have this prayer I say at night before I go to sleep. I say, I am love residing in the Sacred Heart of my Father. I am light residing in the Sacred Heart of Mother Mary. I am Logos residing in the Sacred Heart of Jesus. I am life residing in the Sacred Heart of the Holy Spirit. And I am laughter residing in the Sacred Hearts of the awakened ones. And so identifying this is who I really am. I know that's who I am. Even if I screw up, and forget it on occasion, I know that at core, this is who I am. And that was the message of him. That was the message of the Buddha. And that's the message of all the real mystics. They're kind of prototypes. You can do it because this is who you are. And here's an example. I tried. I got so far. You can do it. You can do it better than I can do it. Give it a go. Give it a go. Yeah.
I have a fantasy of some of the, very literal Jesus people coming after you. I have a fantasy of what that must be like.
They've done that.
They're armed with a few little passages that they've memorized or gotten from their pastor or whatever. And just the breadth of knowledge that you have and hold, what have those experiences and encounters been like for you?
It's interesting to me because it set me free more and more and more. There was one guy who followed me for several years, and every time I gave a homily or did a podcast, he'd append this whole piece that says, the Catholic Church is the one true church. He'd quote, there's a statement in Latin, extra ecclesiam nulla est salus. Outside the Catholic Church, there's no redemption. And every talk I gave, I'd find this in the comment section for years and years and years. And finally, he phoned me, and I had a conversation with him. And he's an Irish guy from Dublin, a very bright guy. He's a PhD in economics. And he's saying, you're leading a whole bunch of people to hell. I said, I want to become a priest myself, and you're an example of what I don't want to be. And I said to him, dude, the last thing in the world that the Catholic Church needs right now is more people like you, more priests like you. And I hung up the phone.
Yeah, it's... This is one of the things that's happening now in culture is there is actually a Christian revival happening because we've dismissed with the field of values. And we're in this postmodern, post-truth world where God has been kicked out of the house. And when God's kicked out of the house, you can be sure that the dark forces are sleeping in every bedroom and eating your Fruit Loops.
Absolutely.
While you're out there. So people have been like, okay, well, we got to go back. Yes. We got to bring God back. And there's not a lot of new pathways that have been paved. So there's a regression back to fundamentalism. And I think I understand the impulse. I'm like, I get it. We got to get God back. And we got to evolve the word.
Yes.
The word was never meant to be flash frozen in this stumbling lurch trying to keep up with the evolution of consciousness. It was meant to be a living Torah.
Yeah, absolutely.
And evolve. And that's the part that's missed. So when people come up to me and like, Jesus is the only way.
Yes.
I say, you got it right almost. Yeah. You just put only in there.
Yes.
But Jesus is the best.
Yes, yeah.
I love Jesus, and that's what I tell him.
He's a prototype.
I love Jesus.
Yeah. I have a theory actually which got me in trouble again as well in the church, that I'm a big believer in reincarnation, which I got walloped with a crozier over that many times. But I actually believe that the character that we know as Jesus of Nazareth, 2,000 years ago, is a reincarnation of Gautama Siddhartha, the Buddha, 550 years before that again. And that this Jesus spirit has been on the planet many times. So that it's not necessary that, that spirit reincarnate as a unique individual person, but that it could reincarnate as a movement. So I think Jesus is on the planet right now, but I don't think he's in the guise of a physical being. I think he's in a movement. And those who are truly awake, that they're the embodiment and the current incarnation of Buddha nature and Christ consciousness or self-realization. I don't care what term we use for it, as long as we realize it means that we're identifying with our soul self. So I talk about 3 levels of the self. I talk about the role self, the soul self, and the source self. So the role self is I'm playing the role of an Irish guy called Sean right now. That's the role I'm playing. But that's not who I am. I am an eternal being who was never born and never die. That's my soul self. I'm one of the Netsutzim, one of the sparks of the divine, created before there was time. And then there's my source self when I let go of the soul, because in some senses, the soul is the first illusion on the way out from God and the last illusion on the way back into God, because ultimately there is only God. But so to have the courage to step myself through it and say, okay, I have to play the role of Sean, as a kind of as a brother, as a clinical psychologist, as a priest, whatever. They're the roles I'm playing. But God forbid I should ever identify and think that that's who I am. I know that I'm an eternal being, and I know that everybody I encounter is an eternal being, that they're netzrotzim. And so at some stages we're kind of escorting each other home until finally we merge with the realization that this is God's dream. When God is finished dreaming, she'll fold up her tent and have another dream.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Out breaths and in breaths.
Exactly.
I had so as I've said, I've practiced psychonaut, so many of my spiritual experiences have been with the medicines.
Brilliant.
One in particular was not. It was actually the first time I was intimate with my wife.
Wow.
And I was lying in bed and I just started to journey. She was falling asleep and I just started to journey. And I went to the place where my soul self resides. So I was in the purview of my soul self. And it was a beautiful place of pure potentiality, quantum potentiality. So anybody who I wanted to call to speak to me, I could speak to their soul self. Anything I wanted to see could come, but it wasn't a landscape. It wasn't like there was flowing fields and people in white gowns. Only if I called them to me, then the most spectacular, beautiful thing could happen. But it was about bringing whatever visions I wanted into the space to interact with. But then I felt a calling. So that was, to me, the first death.
Beautiful.
There's the first death to your soul self.
Absolutely.
And then you have whatever time you have in this timeless state to exist as the soul self. But there was another call, and that call was to let go of the individual perspective of whatever the oversoul Aubrey was, the Aubrey that has been many other names, but that soul that is seated many different forms, to let that go, the second death, and be just merged back with capital L life itself.
That's beautiful.
And I was certainly not ready for that.
Okay.
I was not ready for that experience, although I can get little tastes of it with 5-MeO-DMT or Bufo, where it feels like you just burst into pure love.
Eternity.
In eternity.
Yeah. That's beautiful, brother.
Yeah.
That's really beautiful.
It was really, really special, but that's allowed me to have a different relationship with death.
Absolutely.
Because I understand that there's two deaths. And the first death, I feel like I know what that's like.
Okay.
And then the second death, I can also imagine what that's like, but you can't imagine what it's like because that's why you can't even remember what a 5-MeO-DMT experience is like. It's ineffable because you lose your perspective. You just are. You are is.
Pure awareness.
Exactly.
Right. I've just finished rereading a book by Chris Bash called LSD and the Mind of the Universe. Have you read that?
I've heard of it, but I haven't read it.
It's probably one of the most extraordinary books I've ever read in my life. I've never done LSD, but this guy went on 70 sessions over a 20-year period, secretly, because he was a professor of religious studies at a university. He couldn't reveal what he was doing. But it's the deepest dive into the darkness and into the light that I've ever read about, over 70 different sessions. And he's precisely what you're talking about. But he went into the hells where he was experiencing, not just as an individual level, where his own individual soul had traversed over many incarnations, but actually he was inhabiting, the species soul, the soul of Homo sapiens sapiens, and experiencing the historicity and the darkness that we've experienced, over civilization, if you want to call it that. But the extraordinary visionary experiences he had and the suffering he experienced, and it reminded of what you said a few minutes ago, that there was still some kernel, some kind of soul cell, some spark of the divine that managed to kind of keep him oriented so that he could put up with the darkness and the abuse and the fear he was experiencing and still try to harvest it, not just on his own behalf, but on behalf of the species itself. And he came back with this vision of the times we're approaching right now and this extraordinary cultural shift on a species-wide level. And I've had those same kinds of experiences. I didn't do LSD, but the same kind of visionary experiences where I see that there's an individual karma that my soul has generated over lifetimes. And by karma, I just mean cause and consequence. I don't mean it's all bad stuff. It's all good, some good stuff as well. But that we generate karma as a family, individual family. We generate karma as a culture. We generate karma as a religious organization. And we generate karma as a human family. And that there are waves of souls coming back now to kind of undo the crap we've done in previous versions of ourselves throughout history, and then try to create a template for the future into which we're moving. And I've had these experiences over the last, I would say, 20 years, that we're experiencing this as a culture. And there are some, I call them warriors on the way, people like yourself, who are reaching tens of hundreds, maybe hundreds of thousands of people, who are beginning to wake up, and you're giving them the encouragement and kind of the techniques, perhaps, and the examples of people who are waking up and taking their job seriously. And that's, in some senses, there's a collective karma and there's a collective mission, and I think this time in world history is really special, that there are a lot of very old souls who have kind of joined this particular wave of people coming in order to get us over this hump.
Yeah. It feels like, some of the mythic stories that are in many different cultures. There's the story of Ragnarok, the final battle where Odin takes his spear Gungnir and he points at the enemy, and all of the warriors rise from Valhalla and fight for the good. Armageddon is another story of the angels on high who come to wipe out the corrupted kings, which are like the corporate kings that you see in
oligarchy.
And it's almost as if this has been prophesized in many times, but we're actually living in, for the first time, there's been many versions of Ragnaroks and many little Armageddons, but not a global existential battle between really good and evil, darkness and light.
Yeah,
it's really happening.
It really is happening. It really is happening. I wrote a kind of a manifesto about 2 years ago, precisely about this, that in some senses reinventing the mass media, reinventing the economic models, reinventing religion, reinventing politics, reinventing education, reinventing entertainment, and that there needs to be a whole new version in all these areas. And it's going to be led by light bearers, not by kind of oligarchs who are just, about separating souls from source and making a whole bunch of money in the process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is it. And it's encouraging in some ways, because I see some people waking up, and then there's moments where I get discouraged, where I see somebody who I know has seen what I've seen, and then they'll falter in their commitment. And I go, what more do you need to see? How much more blood needs to be on the streets before you actually are willing to give up whatever worldly trappings you're afraid of losing by fully committing? Like, there's nothing to lose and only everything to the whole world to gain, actually, if you can see from that perspective. But that individual service to self perspective is sticky. It's hard for people to let go of that.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I would say there's service to self as an individual, and there's a service to self as a community. People in my truth bubble who think as I think,
right? And
service to them as well. You're going to support them no matter how crazy, they're thinking, or how poorly they're actually acting, and what disastrous results they're visiting upon us. So, but there's this great passage in the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas, where in the Synoptic Gospels, Christ allegedly says, ask and you shall receive, seek and you shall find, knock and the door shall be opened. So there's 3 pieces to it. In the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas, there are 6 stages to the process. He says, those who seek should not stop searching until they find, stage 2. And when they find, they will be disturbed, stage 3. And when they are disturbed, they will marvel, stage 4. And when they marvel, they will rule, stage 5. And when they rule, they will rest. So what the hell is that about? So you see a lot of people who start out, and they want to search, they want to find the truth. And so stage 1 is they're seeking. Stage 2 is they think they find some way, but they're disturbed. That means I have to give up this. I have to disassociate with these kinds of people. I have to think differently. I don't have a safety net underneath me anymore. I don't think so. Pass on this one. And they go back to the old system. But those who break through, they get to stage 4, which is you marvel. You realize, for the first time in my life, I'm free. I'm thinking for myself. I'm speaking my truth. I'm living as I want to live. And then stage 5 is I rule. I'm the master of my own destiny at this stage. Nobody else is calling the shots. And then finally I'll rest. Not in the sense that I'm going to hang up my gloves, but in the sense that, okay, I've done my work. Now I'm part of the kind of the bigger mission here. Whom can I help to wake up?
Yeah. What a beautiful model.
Yeah.
It's a shame that the Bible was edited in the way that it was edited. There's a lot of, and that's another thing that I think people who are biblical literalists don't understand. This was cobbled together by a council of empire.
Yes.
And to imagine that they didn't actually select this and tailor this to meet whatever their needs were at the time, Constantine and the whole Roman Empire that became the Holy Roman Empire and exists on to this day, it was edited. And there's so much that was left out that's like important.
Absolutely.
And like, can we have a big meeting, y'all? And just say like, hey, let's do a re-edit, like the director's cut from God of the Bible, right?
Beautiful. And so when I kind of parse human history, I see this in religion, I see it in economic model, I see it in educational system, I see it in NGOs, that it goes through the following stages. You start off with some extraordinary charismatic prophetic figure, like a Buddha figure or a Jesus figure, and he's really attractive, his teaching is attractive, his personality is attractive. He's what I would call, a thin place. A place where the veil between the mystical and the mundane is diaphanous, and in that person's company, you get to savor that. Even if you don't fully understand it, you get to savor it somehow and to witness it. So there's a group of disciples gathered around this great avatar figure, stage 2. Stage 3 is almost inevitably the guy's going to get whacked. Yeah? And now they're leaderless. Yeah? Stage 4 is now let's create a kind of let's organize a community around his memory. So they organize a community around his memory. Stage 5 is some crowd elevate themselves into an oligarchy who are in charge of the organization. Stage 6 is now they start creating, dogma. You can't be a member of our group if you don't believe X, Y, and Z. So it's not the teachers anymore, so we're creating what the rules are. So it's like we start off going he's leading us to the West. And the next group says, well, he didn't actually mean the West, he meant Northwest. So this is where we really need to go. And the second generation says, it wasn't actually northwest, it was north, so let's go north. And the next guy says, it's actually northeast, west, northeast, let's go northeast. And the next guy says, no, he actually meant east. And now we're 180 degrees out from where we started.
And that's the story of what happened with the church and the Inquisitions and the witch burnings. It's the absolute inversion of Jesus's teaching. That the devil was hiding in the church for many, many years. And along with God and the people like St. Francis who found that spark and reignited that spark. But that's, that's one of the great tricks, is to hide within the holy. And this is the nature of the upside down. So the Kabbalists call it Sitra Akra, which is the turning of the, I'm sure you know this, the turning of the face from God. And the turning of the face from God creates the upside down world. And there's a great fictional show called Stranger Things, which had a world called the Upside Down. And the upside down mirrored the external world, but it was all dark, and filled with corruption and filled with these, fucking ash and demons and spewing monsters. And but it looked like the regular world, and you could break through the veil and go through. But that's kind of what's happened in so many different cases. So it's the inversion of all that is good, true, and beautiful. Then ends up holding the other absolute opposite polarity, the sitraka of the darkness, the turning of the face from God.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And at this stage, it feels to me like we need to experience and maybe even navigate through that kind of darkness for a period of time so that we truly appreciate the light when we finally discovered it. And the good news and the bad news for me is that, and Satan was hiding inside the Catholic Church, but he's not hiding anymore. Is plain for everybody to see right now. If you look at the Olympics, the opening ceremony of the Olympics, that kind of craziness. So they're out there now and they're kind of pushing it in our faces. So even the dumbest people at this stage must realize, there's a takeover here. Spirituality has been kind of taken hostage. So the stages that you go from mystical spirituality to kind of religion, and you go from religion to morality, and you go from morality to sexuality, and then finally the only sin is a sexual sin. And so we reduced mystical spirituality down to kind of, did you break the sixth commandment or the ninth commandment or whatever? And we just telescope the whole thing. And we lost the whole spirit and the mystical spirit. And so for me, I invented a term years and years and years ago. I call it mysticists, which is the kind of the mating of deep science, real science, not materialism, but deep science with mystical spirituality. And I call them mysticists, people who are au fait with, they're well-versed in science and they're well-versed in mysticism, and they can unify the two. And I'm thinking of people like maybe Tyler Deshada, that have managed to kind of create that gap. And for me, it feels like that's the future of our evolution. A kind of mysticists who are well-versed. We know how the physical cosmos works. We know how to kind of engage with it, to our benefit as incarnated beings, but not identify with it. And at the same time, realize that what's informing all of this is a deep mystical understanding that there is only God.
In your book, you had a great, passage and section of it where you talk about how you, much like the Buddha said, how you take ideas and you scrape them and you test them to see if it's real gold. Exactly. And you apply the love test as one test. Is like, is this in accord with love? Because if it's true, it's a synonym to love.
Absolutely.
If it's true, it's a synonym to love. So does it pass the love test?
Exactly.
Does it pass the compassion test?
Totally.
Does it pass all of these other tests to actually look at things where we've gotten myopically focused on, quote, facts, which are all based on, and this was also another really revealing and enlightening thing for me to read, is that all facts, all scientific models, even mathematics, are based on
postulate,
Absolutely. Which is a faith-based.
Absolutely.
It's all based on some faith.
Absolutely. Totally. I remember, I think it was Kurt Gödel, who was a very famous Austrian mathematician in 1931, came up with the incompleteness theorem, where he proved mathematically that no axiomatic system, whether it's in philosophy or mathematics, can be both consistent and complete. It can be consistent but not complete, or complete but not consistent. So you have to start off with a postulate that you can't prove. And if you start off with one postulate, you'll build very, very slowly, and you'll have much more completeness because there are fewer loopholes in it, but it's going to take you forever to erect the system. If you start with a bunch of postulates which you can't prove, you'll build a lot faster, but it'll be far less complete, a lot more holes in it. So, for instance, when Pythagoras was inventing his geometry, he started with 5 postulates, which appear to be self-evident, but they're not. So one of them was, the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. That seems to be self-evident, but you can't prove it. You cannot prove that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. So his theory of geometry is predicated on 5 of these postulates, none of which can be proven. But you accept those and you can build this really elegant system which has extraordinary pragmatic applications. So when you realize that, you realize every system is built on faith. Now the question is, what is your basic faith? If your basic faith is that there is only God and we're kind of holographic fractals of source, then you can build a system and test it every time. As you say, you did it very beautifully at the beginning today when you talked about the different virtues like compassion and love and forgiveness and whatever. And what I would say is that every single virtue is simply love in a different environment. One environment is going to call it out as courage, another is going to call it out as compassion, another is going to call it out as, forgiveness. But ultimately, there's only love. And give me an environment, I put love into it, and I'll show you a virtue which is a kind of pertinent for the situation. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, and this is a construction of my own teacher, Mark Gaffney, that there's the value and the field of value, and all the values are part of capital V value itself. Yeah. And eros value is the fabric of the universe, of God itself. And these values, so there's first principles and first values that all follow along this. So I was able to, as I'm in my own study, and he comes from the, Kabbalist Wisdom of Solomon tradition. Yeah. But it's been beautiful to study that and to start to see the values as a field and value as real. Right. And then, of course, the inversion of that is what we were talking about earlier, the denial of value, that value isn't real. And in this environment where we've gotten rid of value, this is where now, if there's no value, then there's no good or bad. There's nothing else. So Satan might as well be on parade. We might as well put him in the opening ceremony of the Olympics. We might as well. It's now out, as you said, like out in the open. It used to be kind of fun to dress
Yes.
up as Satan
Yes.
for Halloween, but
Yes.
now
Yeah.
it's so real
Yeah.
that you can't even do that anymore.
Exactly.
It's like
Exactly.
It's like this is not like
Yes.
okay, you got to put away
Yeah.
your devil masks now because people are
Yeah.
actually following this anti-value. It's not just a Halloween
Exactly.
situation anymore.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So it's like, in some senses, I'm a big believer, but from my grandfather, I was taught all the old Irish mythology. I was raised bilingually in Gaelic and in English. And I would spend a lot of my summer holidays when I was in high school in areas in Ireland where Gaelic is still the mother tongue. They're called Gaeltacht in Irish. And I remember being in a village called Coolay during my summer vacation between my kind of junior and senior years in high school. And I'm collecting proverbs. In Irish, we call them shanochel, which literally means ancient words. And I'm going around to all the elders in the village. I'm saying, give me a shanochel and tell me, in what context would you use it? So I collected 432 proverbs during the summer. And I remember this one old man saying to me, he said, if Christianity had never come to Ireland, we could live according to the proverbs. And he was absolutely right. And it's one of the things I said when I went to Kenya, and I'm learning some Kenyan languages and kind of immersing myself in the mythology and the folklore of East Africa. And I'm saying to people, if Christianity had never come to Africa, you could live according to your proverbs. So my job here is not just to kind of baptize you and convert you. My job is, I'm going to tell you my proverbs and you tell me your proverbs. And we see what emerges. We see, what Carl Jung called a kind of a Gnostic intermediary. Somebody who's so well versed in two totally different systems that he can cross-fertilize them to their mutual benefit. And then both sides are growing. And so I say, okay, here is an Irish, Catholic, Celt, here are my stories. Tell me your stories. Tell me your proverbs. And now there's a meeting place. What will emerge from this kind of a cross-fertilization of cultures?
Mm.
Yeah.
What are the stories that from your culture about the utilization of what we would call magic now, which was more, I think, a part of everyday life and this more mystical access to the divine and to spirit? Merlin, as I understand it, was not one person, but was a title of like a wizard. That was the head wizard. That was the guy.
Yeah. So there's when you think about the kind of the history of the island of Ireland, which is up the west coast, is as far west in Europe as you can go. The next parish is New York, and so in some sense we're really cut off a lot. So there were only a few kind of waves of immigrants who came at various stages. So at one stage you had a group called the Tuatha De Danann, called the people of the goddess Dana. And the mythology says that they were actually refugees from Atlantis. And so in Gaelic, we have two terms for that place. One of the terms is called Tír na nÓg, which means the land of the ever young, which is exactly what I call this place here. My land I call Tír na nÓg. And the other name we had for it was Tír Fáthán, which means the land under the waves. So the belief system that refugees, after the sinking of Atlantis, some of them went to Mesoamerica, and some of them came eastwards, and some of them landed in Ireland. And we call them the Tuatha De Danann, the people of the goddess Dana. And they were these mythical characters with this extraordinary technology, not necessarily machine technology. They may have evolved that, but kind of mental technology, intuition, prophecy, clairvoyance, clairaudience, clairsentience, psychokinesis, stuff like that. So in many senses, they were magicians. And they kind of ruled Ireland for I know many thousands of years. And then the Celts came about 600 BCE, and they came from Eastern Europe and came through Spain, Portugal, and up the west coast of Europe and landed in Ireland. And there were two famous battles between the Tuatha De Danann and the Celts at a place called, I remember the name in a minute, but the Celts won both battles. So there was an agreement made between the two groups that they would divide the land of Ireland equally between them. They divide, but it wasn't that one group got the east and the other got the west, or one got the north and the other got the south. The Celts got all of Ireland above the ground, and the Tuatha De Danann got all of Ireland beneath the ground. So they shapeshifted, and they became what is known afterwards as the fairy folk, or the leprechauns. Leprechaun in Gaelic is Laur Chapán, which literally means little-bodied. tiny people, so that they literally could shapeshift, and that they could change their morphology and change their kind of the size and their density of who they were, and that they literally went underground and created, their own version of Atlantis under land rather than, above the land. And so we have this notion then that these were magicians, these are the Merlins of the world, who had all those extraordinary abilities, and that was lost by the Celts and subsequent groups, who put more kind of focus on a kind of a technological kinds of machine technology rather than mental technology. So for us, Irish growing up in that mythology, we would totally accept the fact that these beings are real. Leprechauns, fairy folk, whatever, gnomes, water sprites, tree spirits, they're absolutely real. But you have to have a special kind of vision to see it, or there are special times of the year. So in Gaelic, we call special places like groves of trees or mountaintops or lakes, we call them chaeloites. A chaeloite means a thin place, a place where the veil between the mystical and the mundane is diaphanous, and where, you can kind of go through it, literally walk through it on some occasions, particularly in some famous festivals, like the 1st of February we call Fiara, and then the 1st of May we call Bealtaine, and the 1st of August we call Lunasa, and the 1st of November we call Samhain. And these are times when the veil is especially thin, and you can literally walk through it, or beings come through from both sides. And I'm raised with that kind of stuff, expecting, those kinds of encounters. And so when my great-grandmother, who was alive until I was about 10 years of age, when I heard her speaking to Mother Mary, out loud, and I'm privy to this conversation, that was completely natural to me. She could see through the veil. I couldn't, unfortunately, but I could hear her. So I was privy to one side of the conversation. I was totally convinced that she was real, and this was a real conversation. And so that came kind of second nature to me, that this is our birthright, but we've forfeited it, that we've developed knowledge instead of wisdom. And I define them very differently. For me, knowledge is data which are generated by the sensorium and processed by the brain, whereas wisdom is data that are generated by the soul and processed by the heart. Mm-hmm. So it's a very different kind of relationship to truth. Mm. And that the mystics, they have both wisdom and knowledge. They're able to exist in the physical world, and that's why I coined the term mysticist, that somebody who can operate in the physical world, and be able to, grow their food or kind of drive a car or whatever, but that's not their home base. Their home base is the mystical, and they can only access that through wisdom. Mm. So reason is not going to get you, which is why Jesus insisted on only speaking in parables and stories, and his audience were pissed with him. There's a great passage in Matthew's Gospel in chapter 13 where on 2 occasions they said to him, "Why are you always talking the stupid stories? Talk plainly to us." And he gives 2 different answers. The first time he said, "I speak in parables so that seeing you may see, but not understand, hearing you may hear, but not comprehend." He's saying, if you're listening to me with your ears and trying to understand me with your brain, you're not going to get it. And the second time he was asked, he said, "I speak in parables so that I may reveal things which have been hidden since the foundation of the world." In other words, dudes, there are some truths which are so deep, you can't articulate them in philosophical terminology or in kind of a scientific parlance. You got to go someplace else. You got to dance it. You got to sing it. You got to play it on a musical instrument. You have to go plant medicine or whatever. Mm-hmm. That's the way you can get to that place. You can't get that through your brain. Mm.
Just thinking personally, I'm writing 2 books right now. One is a poetry compilation.
Beautiful.
And it's flowing so smoothly because it's just poetry.
Absolutely.
And it's a captured sentiment, a real feeling that I had and whatever that comes through. And the other is a big book. It's a sequel, and in some ways a sequel, follow-up to my first book, but on a much more mystical landscape. You versus anti, you grappling with this inner force of resistance, accessing the full breadth of your potential and all of your spiritual power. And that book is so much harder.
Of course.
Because I'm trying to explain
data
and actually do it. But the poetry is easy. The
Absolutely.
art, the song, the chants, the ecstatic dances, all of that is like, oh yeah, that's the easy way. The hard way is to try and put it into word, because I can look at it and be like, what am I even doing?
Exactly.
But I'm still doing it nonetheless, as you have as well.
Absolutely.
And labored into the language to try and make it if not true, as clear as possible, and
Exactly.
if not true, as loving as possible.
Absolutely. So that brings me to Aubrey then to think about the story of the Tower of Babel that we find in Genesis. I think it's Genesis maybe chapter 11, where allegedly God comes down and he's really pissed that humans are trying to build a structure that's going to reach the heavens. Now I think actually that the Elohim, which is the word that is used, one of the names for God, is actually plural. And that actually I think they're sky beings, they're extraterrestrial entities. I believe there are the kind of three kinds of gods that we're dealing with. The first one I call geographical divinities, who are associated with a particular piece of real estate. And you move into the real estate, you have to kind of worship them. You move into a different place, you worship the other guy. That's the first kind of gods. And the second kind of gods I call tribal divinities. So they're a group, they're gods who are attached to a particular tribe. And if the tribe wanders, they wander with the tribe. And the third kind of gods I call portfolio gods. If you're interested in agriculture, there's the guy to follow. Interested in music, there's the guy. Interested in lovemaking, that's the guy. Interested in rain, that's the guy. And so people are wondering, which God should we follow? So when the Israelites, come into the promised land, and they're saying, this God who led us out of Egypt is a war God. He knows a lot about war. He doesn't seem to know diddly squat about agriculture. There's famine after famine after famine. So let's change gods. Let's move on to this guy called Baal. And so you got this problem then with the gods and the divinities. And so I begin to think then, who's really up there calling the shots? And it's not anything that we can articulate, in rational language. The best we can do is kind of intuitive. But these gods came down, these Elohim came down, and they saw us, I think, trying to build a spaceport to go up to meet the sky gods where they'd come from. And the guy said, no, you're not going to do it in our watch. And so they came down. And I don't think they confused their tongues. It's not like everybody was speaking like Esperanto, and now we're speaking 7,000 different languages all of a sudden. I think it was that we didn't have language. We had intuitive capacities. We had telepathic abilities. And we could translate immediately. We could download whole ideas from one mind to the other without having to use words, which are really leaky vessels. And what the gods did was they knocked out that faculty and they gave us language instead. And there's I think probably the greatest linguist of the 20th century, a guy called Ferdinand de Saussure. He was a Swedish linguist. And he talked about three elements of oral language. He called it the referent, the signified, and the signifier. So I'm walking in the bush in East Africa, and I see this, pachyderm with two big long tusks like this, and I create an image in my mind. So that's the referent in the real world. And so I create an image in my mind, and it's part visual, it's part olfactory, I can smell him, it's part tactile, I reached out, it's part auditory because he bellowed, and I come back now and we're sitting around the fire and I'm telling you about what I encountered. Now I'm going to have to use signifiers to kind of articulate the signified, the image I have in my mind. But here's all the problems. I have no guarantee that the signified in my mind anywhere resembles what the referent actually was, because it was basically electromagnetic signals that I translated into an elephant, and I stored it as elephant in my mind, and then I articulated, and if I'm talking Swahili to you, I'm going to say, ndovu, if I'm speaking Kalenjin to you, I'm going to say beliot, if I'm talking English to you, I'm going to say elephant, and so I'm going to have to find these signifiers, and I have no idea whether you understand by the signifiers what I meant by the signifiers. And so once you're dependent upon oral language, there's all kinds of pitfalls that we fall into. And that was the Babel, that was the curse of Babel, that we were now dependent on language rather than being these telepathic abilities who could literally download the referent, from one mind to the other without ever having to use signifieds or signifiers.
And this is a mild problem when it comes to elephants, but a big problem when it comes to angels, a big problem. And I really think that, we have all of these terms, aliens, star beings, angels, probably the same thing, and we just call them different things, but they have much, much different meanings when we hear them. Absolutely. But actually, it's like we're really referencing the same kind of cosmological phenomenon, and which has its own ontology, which is real. But our interpretations at that level, it's so difficult to actually understand. So, like Mother Mary, for example, and I want to talk about this specifically because your grandmother had direct contact. So let's talk about Mother Mary, because that's an angelic being, if you like, or a portfolio God in some ways, and she has certain qualities that have been attributed to her. So what is your understanding of Mother Mary?
So the Catholic Church has done a real kind of messy job around here. Way back in the early times, she was given the title Theotokos in Greek, which means the Mother of God. Now the thing is, how can a human woman, give birth to God? Now, Meister Eckhart said very famously at one stage in the 1300s, he said, "Of what use to me is it that my Saviour was born of a virgin 1300 years ago? If he's not born again in my time, in my heart, every single one of us is meant to be the Mother of God." So I think that's what she represented. I talk about it as Christ consciousness is kind of the male articulation of God, and I call this Christa consciousness is the female articulation. And I think there was a group of souls, a cohort of souls, who came in 2,000 years ago. I think they'd been here before in other guises, maybe as Isis or Tara, or Shekinah, but this was their time, 2,000 years ago. And the objective of the exercise was to introduce Christa consciousness or Christ consciousness or Buddha nature. I think they'd been on the planet 550 years before and doing the same thing within Hinduism at the time. So for me, they represented, what the female kind of contribution of the divine is and what the male contribution of the divine is. And they come in as this cohort, and they create a scenario in which they're trying to create a community which can recognize the feminine face of God and the masculine face of God. Now, the church buries that. So I came up with a facetious argument a few years ago. I can imagine that Mary, the mother of Jesus, who literally gave birth to the Christ child, nursed it at her own breast, fed it, and then took it down from the cross in the Pieta and laid it in her arms. But she can't be a priest because she's a female. You can't be a priest, if you're in the Catholic Church. So I have this fictitious story. I say, Sunday morning, and Mary gets on her cell phone, and she calls Mary of Magdala. She says, Mary, where's St. Peter saying Mass today? I'd like to attend Mass. And Mary gives her the coordinates, and they wind up, and Peter is saying Mass. And Peter has his back turned to the crowd, and he's doing his shtick. And they come to communion, and he turns around, and he's going to give communion. And Mary kneels obediently, and she sticks her tongue out, and Peter takes a host and says, "The body of Christ." Peter, who denied Christ, and he's a man, is going to tell Mary, who conceived him and carried him and birthed him, "Here's the body of Christ." Yeah? But you can't be a priest. You can't do that for me because you're just a woman. You can give me the real Christ, but you're not allowed to do it in the host. So I can imagine I'm getting into big trouble with this. And so I'm saying, that she represents the feminine face of God, as Shekinah did within Judaism, or Isis did, or Tara did. And so it represents the fact that when God, presents in human guise in order to move the stuck wheels of human evolution, spiritual evolution, God comes down as personages, but it's always a complete one. Now, the Catholic Church, in spite of the fact that they called it Theotokos way back 1,500 years ago, which means the Mother of God, they're definite, she didn't give birth to a divinity. She could only give birth to his humanity. But he was God because he was God and man. So in some senses, she's the Mother of God, but she's not the Mother of a divinity. So get your head around that one. Now, in 1950, they create this new doctrine, a new feast called the Assumption of Mary into Heaven. That when Mary died, she was taken body and soul into heaven. Her body did not corrupt. And that the Protestant church in Europe went crazy. Said the Catholic Church has finally lost its marbles completely. Now they're kind of elevating Mary to be the kind of a cohabitant in heaven with Jesus. And Carl Jung was the only guy who picked up, and he says, for the first time ever, the Catholic Church got it right. It's not a trinity, it's a quaternity. It's the mandala, it's the perfect shape, is the mandala. So you've got the Father and the Son, and you've got the Spirit, and you've got the Mother. And what is the Spirit? The Spirit, again, is the fertile womb in which embryonic Christ consciousness is marinated, in the amniotic fluid of pure love. So the Spirit is the feminine divine. And so if you took a cross, you got the Father and the Son, you got the Mother, Mary, and you got the Shekinah, or got the Spirit. So it's the perfect mandala. But the church wasn't intending to do that, but that's what it did actually. So it unthinkingly elevated her into her divinity. And then the Protestants said that they've lost their marbles, and Jung said, no, they've finally figured out what the story is. So when I think of my relationship with Mary, she represents, a particular incarnation of the feminine face of the divine that came in with a specific mission 2,000 years ago with a small cohort. I think it was she and Jesus' figure and Mary of Magdala, and I would say maybe John the Baptist. And they were starting a whole new movement, a whole new development, of Christ consciousness or Christa consciousness on the planet. So when I think of Mary, that's what I think of. I'm not thinking just of a woman, an obedient woman who you said, yes, Jesus, whatever you want, Jesus, what would you like for breakfast, Jesus?
That doesn't make much sense.
Can you imagine any Jewish mother saying that?
It doesn't make much sense. Yeah. So we've been flirting with these ideas that are kind of bringing me into the Book of Enoch and the Sumerian texts about the Anunnaki. And what's your view of the Nephilim and the Anunnaki and all of these stories?
It's interesting. When I was writing the last book, Setting God Free, I actually had a whole chapter on my belief system that those regarded as gods in the scriptures were actually extraterrestrial entities, and that we created cargo cults out of them. I don't know if you're familiar with the notion of a cargo cult. Yeah, that we created cargo cults in which we worship these beings. And I have a good friend, Paul Wallace, an Australian. I don't know if you come across Paul's work. He's written a trilogy, the Eden series, where he examines the original Hebrew and Aramaic scripts and shows that the word God is never actually used in the Hebrew scriptures. They're using two terms. They're using either Elohim, which means the powerful ones, plural, and it always goes with plural verbs in Hebrew. And the other one is Yud-He-Vov-He, the tetragrammaton, which can't be pronounced. Nobody knows how to pronounce it. It has no kind of etymological basis in any of the kind of Semitic languages. Nobody knows where it got imported from, and nobody knows how it can be pronounced. And allegedly, only the high priest, one day of the year, on the feast of, would go into the Holy of Holies and pronounce this sacred name. But nobody knows how it can be pronounced. And so what he shows is that actually those that we've been worshipping were extraterrestrials who created cargo cults out of us. And
explain cargo cults, because I understand what it is, but for the audience who might not know.
Cargo cult. So during World War II, both the Japanese and the American airmen were using kind of Micronesian and Polynesian islands as kind of supply stations. They were landing on these places, and they were very, very kind of technologically unsophisticated natives living in these places. So these airmen would come in, and they'd create landing strips and they'd drop down and they'd bring a whole bunch of cargo with them, medicines and food and clothes and stuff like that, and they gifted them to the natives, And so the war ended and these guys disappeared, never came back. The Japanese went home and the Americans went home, and suddenly these guys said, where's the cargo? How do we get these guys back? So they started building airstrips and they started building, bamboo, towers, and they started building, putting heads on them and trying to make contact to bring them back so they could get more goodies. So they literally created a kind of a religion out of it. Now, I think that a lot of the worship of the gods were cargo cultists, who've been kind of gaslighted by literally extraterrestrial societies with greater technology who came down here to mine planet Earth for particular resources, and needed a workforce, and modified a particular group of hominids to do their bidding, and they've experimented with it. And so they created Adam. If you're familiar with Hebrew and in Swahili, Hebrew and Swahili are related in some senses. So in Hebrew, the word Adam comes from the word dam, which means blood, and it also means clay. So it's a being created from the clay and from the blood. That they mixed their own genetic code with clay on the ground and they created these beings. And in Swahili, we got the same thing. In Swahili, the word for blood is damu. And the word for a human being is bin Adamu, the son of one who came from the blood of these guys. And so the cargo cults then were religions that were created in worship of beings that were so technologically more sophisticated that we believe that they were actually divine beings. And they were happy to allow us to believe that. And so that we've created all of these religions. And that the Jesus of the world or the Buddhas of the world come back to say, you're worshiping the wrong guys. It's about love. It's not about slavery. It's not about wiping out, the enemies. It's not about conquering, a new land. It's not about, killing a woman who was found not to be virginal on her wedding night. It's not about, killing somebody who was gathering, firewood on the Sabbath. And none of these are from the Father. And so when Christ was asked very famously at one stage, a Pharisee came to him and he said, of all the commandments of Torah, which is the most important? And there are 613 precepts in Torah. And Christ said, the most important one is love the Lord your God with your whole heart and your whole soul and your whole mind and your whole being. And as a bonus, I'm going to tell you what the second one is, even though you didn't ask for it. The second one is love your neighbor as you love yourself. So he's saying basically there's only one commandment, is to love. All of the other stuff, you can make it up, you can wash your hands, you can do whatever the hell you want, has nothing got to do with God. If it lights your lamp, go ahead. Yeah. But we built religions around that, and we've insisted, that my friend Ireland, she's my neighbor, and she's a fluent Hebrew speaker and a Yiddish speaker, and we're watching a series on Chai. It's an Israeli movies right now, and we just finished one, a series of 6 in the Bnei Barak community of ultra-Orthodox in Jerusalem. And the craziness that these guys have to go on with in order to maintain their purity. And you look at that, for instance, with the kind of the essence of Judaism, which is respect for law and for love and compassion. You say, where the hell did these guys get all these stupid rules? Mm-hmm. So as on one occasion, there's a guy visiting in Ukraine, and he's offered a basket of fruit, and he's ultra-Orthodox, and he's wondering, did they pick this fruit on the Sabbath, and therefore did they break the Sabbath? And if I eat the piece of fruit, I'm going to participate in this. Or I'm offered an egg. Did the hen lay this egg on the Sabbath? And if it did, if I eat the egg, I'm participating in her sin because she broke the Sabbath. And you get this total kind of mishigas. And you get it in every religious system, that we've reduced, mystical spirituality down to fundamentalist precept. And for me, then they're basically cargo cults that were landed upon us in order to create servants that were needed for a particular job, which was to mine gold in South Africa at a period of time for the Anunnaki.
Mm. Yeah. And you see this not only in the religions, you see it in spiritual traditions as well. I see it in the plant medicine traditions and in other indigenous traditions as well. Oh, you're on your moon? Yeah. You can't go in the sweat lodge because you'll defile the lodge. Like what? What are you talking? What are you talking about? And respect to these cultures that have these beliefs. Like, I'm not trying to be an affront to that. I just fundamentally disagree. And my understanding of Great Spirit is that the Great Spirit loves equally all those who bleed and welcome all those into, and again, all respect all these, but same with these very strict dieta rules in like the Shipibo traditions and ideas that have developed, which don't have, in my opinion, anything to do with the actual spirit of ayahuasca or the actual spirit of God itself. Yeah. They can be helpful. Right. Maybe you will be too exhausted if you're on your moon and you go into lodge, and maybe you should sit out, but that should be your choice. Or maybe you shouldn't, have all of these bad foods. Certainly not before you go to ayahuasca. You'll purge it all out, and it'll be a rougher ride. And
absolutely.
So there's some wisdom that may have been in there. Maybe pork had trichomoniasis.
Yes, exactly.
And it had a parasite in it, so you don't eat pork. Okay, there was some wisdom there, but to say that now this is God's law, I'm like, it's crazy. I don't know about that.
Yeah, it's deadly. And so we had this system within the Catholic Church, for instance, that when a woman gave birth, that she was unclean. She couldn't go to Mass. So after a period of purification, after giving birth to a child, she could come to the back of the church on a Sunday when all the church had left, and that she'd be churched. She'd be purified by a male celibate priest. So for the kind of indignity and the sin of giving birth to a new life form, she had to be purified before she could come back the next Sunday and participate with the saints in the pews. It was just crazy making that the gift of life, is demonized so that you be purified from bringing life into the world, and that you could actually think that this was from God. So what I see is that there's the difference between a ritual, and legislation. I think ritual is the kind of the liturgical dance of sacramental, mystical experiences. And so there are certain kinds of ceremonies that elevate the kind of the mind or the soul, whether it's dancing or drumming or singing, or chanting or doing particular signs, the sign of the cross or genuflecting, whatever. There are particular liturgical rituals that change the mindset and put you in an altered state of consciousness, and they're really important. But when you dogmatize it and say, in the absence of X, it won't work. So I always remember my first year in the seminary, and the ordination class The 15 guys had just been ordained, and they're hanging around for about another month before they're sent off to Africa. I know each of them has to say Mass on his own. And in the Catholic tradition, a priest can't say Mass on his own. There has to be a congregation of at least one to witness it. And so all of the other students would be in an attendant. There'd be one student for each of these newly ordained priests. And I'm helping this guy, Frankie McCall, if I still remember him. Brilliant guy, theologian, has spent 8 years studying theology, and now he's saying his first Mass, and I'm attending him. And there are 2 candles on the altar, and we get halfway through the Mass, and he suddenly realizes the candles aren't lighting. I forgot to light the candles. And he's freaking out. And there's other guys at other altars around the place, and they're saying their first Mass as well, and all the candles are lighting. He's thinking, holy fuck, this is not going to be a real Mass. It's not going to work. Jesus is not going to come down. It's just going to be a piece of bread. It won't be Jesus anymore. And he looks at me and says, light the candles, light the candles. So I light the candles, and he goes back to the beginning of Mass, and he starts from the beginning again, and he goes through the Mass. After 8 years of theology, and he's convinced that if the candles aren't lighting, Jesus is going to say, no, not going down there. No, there's no candles there. Try again.
Very stubborn Jesus.
Yeah. And you're thinking, why were candles? Candles were because there was no electricity.
Yeah.
And you needed it to see who was there.
Right.
Yeah. And then the church made a rule that the candles had to be 80% beeswax. Otherwise, it didn't work. So if Jesus had a look and there were only 65% beeswax, he said, sorry, guys, no, I cancel the trip.
This is the premise of, one of the great premises of setting God free. It's setting God free from the trappings of our mind, the trappings of fundamentalism of all different varieties, and having that direct connection where you just know the living, breathing God. And, another interesting thing is I was, for whatever reason, particularly attracted to studying the biography of Rasputin.
Wow.
And
interesting.
And what was so interesting about that is I had a lot of suspicions about the kind of religious precepts of the time, especially regarding sex. And so I think I don't know why I got on, I took out some books from the library. I actually kept the books from the library, paid all the fees, and I still have the books with the library cards about Rasputin. But, the story of Rasputin, he's in the woods and he gets a visitation from the Black Virgin Mary, a vision, and he's wrestling with the ideas of sexuality that have come through the church. And the Black Virgin Mary shows him images of the deers that are fornicating and having, life that's creating life. And she says, this is life creating life.
Yeah.
God has created, this is the way for life to create life. And he's like, aha, I got it. Right. And so then he became who he became, obviously deeply mystical man. And he had his own, challenges or whatever, but by all accounts, he could heal with his hands and heart and mind, but he was very sexually voracious as well. And so he had these ideas, and perhaps that idea of being a man of God and sexually voracious was something that was inherently appealing to me as somebody who's actually following not dissimilar path. But also understanding the bounds of, with that appetite comes the worship and respect and love of the feminine. Absolutely. Like you can't separate and split those two, but it's not the appetite itself that's the problem. It's not the act itself that's the problem. It's actually when you put that act in the shadow, then it can create all kinds of downstream damage.
Absolutely.
But so much guilt and shame and everything has been laid on the world around sexuality. And I think that's really what's underpinning all of this, so much of the pedophilia and sexual abuse and trauma, is that sex has been placed in the shadow and demonized.
Totally. Absolutely. And so as what I say, I see this trajectory again and again and again. I mentioned it earlier. You start off with this extraordinary mystical impulse. All religions are born of a beautiful mystical impulse. I think it was Sri Nisargadatta who said at one stage, if you come across the tracks of religion in the desert, follow them. But don't go where they're leading, go back to where they came from. So it always begins with a mystical impulse. And then at some stage, it devolves, and descends into a mere religion, kind of empty, dogmatic kinds of stuff. And then very often it disintegrates further from religion into kind of morality. It's all about ethics. And the ethics then disintegrates into sexuality, and that the only sin is sex. And at that stage then, they're totally focused on sex, and it's dissociated completely from the gift of life and the gift of love and the gift of coupling, and the union of the yin and the yang, and the union of the feminine and the masculine and the divine itself. And so you've dissociated this completely, and now you get one group who are just focused completely on the kind of the coupling and on the kind of the orgasm and kind of just the physiology and the biochemistry of it, without any appreciation whatsoever of the mystery that's been enacted here, the gift of life and the gift of love that's been communicated between the two people, and that's all lost completely. And so you got one crowd demonizing it, and then you got the other crowd indulging it and totally misunderstanding that it's a sacred act. It's not just about bodily behavior. It's about a sacred act of creating life. And so you create all this kind of disgusting behavior where you're kind of indoctrinating kids, with drag queens coming into kindergarten kids and sexualizing them way before they have appreciation of who they are, what their bodies are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. This is also, one of the symptoms of what we're experiencing in this strange time. And I think these things are all coming to light. They're coming to the forefront where this used to be in the shadows and, in some back studio at the MGM offices in Hollywood or wherever the nexus of these things were. You hear stories from Shirley Temple and things like that. This was always going on, but now it's in the forefront and we're starting to get to see it. And I think it's causing a reaction in people to actually, hopefully not just look at what they can see, but then go all the way into the shadow. Right. But then in doing that, not go too far to regress to some kind of fundamentalist dogma where there can be no transsexuals and no homosexuality and go too far, like the pendulum. And that's also one of the proclivities of human beings is when things they swing instead of finding back to the equilibrium.
Homeostasis. You're absolutely right. And you picked up on this much earlier in the conversation, Aubrey. It was beautiful that in the sense of waking up to the kind of the situation in which we find ourselves now as a world community, that we've realized that it was the abolition of spirituality and mystical spirituality in particular, that led to our downfall. And you can understand why it happened, because spirituality had been reduced to religion, and religion had been reduced to morality, and morality had been reduced again to sexuality. And so you're literally kind of manacling people from life. And so the response was to kind of go to the other extreme, as you're saying, the swing of the pendulum. And so the job for us at this stage then is to realize that we're not going to solve the world problem unless we put spirituality and mystical spirituality back at the center of it. But we have to make sure that it doesn't evolve again into fundamentalism, because at that stage we're going to just recreate the old problems.
Right.
And so it's finding that sweet spot where we're deeply mystically spiritual people who are in love with life and with Gaia, and whatever Gaia has to offer, whether it's good food or good wine or good sex or whatever it is, realizing that that is a gift to be celebrated and honored, not just utilized in a kind of a fetish fashion and not demonized in a kind of a fundamentalist fashion. Finding that sweet space in life.
The advantage that we have in that mission as the warriors on the way is it's so good. Yeah. The balance is so good. If you swing either way, one, you're too far on the ascetic path and you're avoiding all of these spectacular pleasures and gifts of Shekinah and Isis and the mother and the creation and Eros and the beauty of all of it. You're giving up all of that, or the ability to eat and taste the amazing food and all of the sensorial beauty that we have. Okay, that's too far. And then there's also the full hedonic, there's no value, and then you're in, what Gafton calls pseudo-eros, these counterfeit pleasures, which are ultimately unsatisfying and unsatiating and lead to this hungry ghost mentality where all you can do is get more and more and more because you get less and less of a hit out of it. So you got both of these extremes, but in the middle, it's so good.
Brilliant.
It's so fucking good. Right. And so it's like living that story and just allowing that story to be so much more attractive than the other stories. Because it is.
Absolutely. Have you come across the work of Robert Gilbert?
I have, yeah. Had him on the podcast.
Brilliant. So, his notion of the vesica, the intersection of the two sets. I really love that idea, that in some senses you need the light and the dark, and that is the overlap of the two, that both are necessary in order to find the real truth, the real light in there. And I have a theory between the kind of the dance between contractions and kind of contractions and expansion. And everything I see in life is a dance between these two, when you look, for instance, at Big Bang was the first great expansion of our universe. And then at some stage, you needed dark matter to pull stuff together to create the first stars and the first planetary systems. So now you needed kind of this compact, this kind of what's the word I'm looking, constriction in some way. And at some stage, they go supernova. That first generation of stars goes supernova, and there's this radical expansion again out into space. And then there's the second contraction that gives birth to the second order of sun. So our sun is a second generation sun. So they needed the contractions to come back in again. So this contraction and expansion model, and we see it on the planet. We see, for instance, there have been 6 great extinctions where the planet just threw off, 80% of life. And then there's this burgeoning of new life. So there's, the expansion, contraction again. And we see it in our own bodies. We see our cells dying off at hundreds of thousands a minute. In this conversation, we'll share millions of cells of our bodies with each other. Every month, every single skill cell in your body is going to be replaced. 50% of the dust in your home is dead skin cells. And so it's this contraction expansion. And I see this with the birth process. So a woman's womb, when she's not pregnant, is about the size of a lemon. When she's fully pregnant, it's about the size of a water lemon. So it has to expand to accommodate the developing embryo. But then the contractions start and the child is freaking out. And you have this then, Stan Groff's perinatal matrices, I don't know if you got into that. And now, the walls are coming in, the roof is coming down, the floor is coming up, and the kid is freaking out. And the cervix is still closed, there's no way out, and he's freaking out. Contractions are getting more and more intense. Then at some stage, then the cervix open, and now he's engaged with the birth canal, and there's this long journey to freedom. And then there's the expansion of coming out into a totally different world. And so we constantly have this expansion-contraction model. And I see this in our theologies and our spiritualities. There needs to be the contraction of kind of the darkness in order to kind of energize us for the expansion of giving birth and new life again. So I watch what's happening in our world, and I think that the contractions are a necessary part of giving birth. So I'm not demonizing them or kind of cursing in the sense, I wish it were different. Because I know that without the contractions, we'd be just whirling our thumbs with me in this kind of a neutral space, just idling our life away.
Yeah. That's a beautiful application of the Groff's basic perinatal matrices with the spiritual transformation that we're going through. Because, all right, so BPM 1, basic perinatal matrix 1, you're in the womb, and all your needs are taken care of. This is Eden.
Absolutely.
This is Eden. Everything is taken care of. You got this, you're living in harmony with the land and nature. This is, Lemuria, in the just living on the islands and the Pacific, fishing and making love, and, it's heaven. Yeah. And then the water breaks, and then everything starts to close in, and there's no way out, and the cervix isn't open yet, so you got nowhere to go, and it's just panic and chaos, and you think you're going to die, and it's like everything is shifting. That's BPM 2, and we're in this kind of that period, but then BPM 3 starts, where there starts to be an opening. And the opening is where the warriors come and say, oh, there's a way through. There's a way through, and we're going to fight. And we're going to push, and the mother's with you, like pushing, and shit's coming out. And you talk about this too, shit's coming out, piss is coming out, screams are coming out. Typically they were squatting when they were doing it, not laying paralyzed on their back, which is a whole problem with the whole birthing situation. But that's not the point of this. But this is the time for the new soul and the mother to be working in conjunction as one force, as like a warrior force, to actually make it through the other side. And then this big gasp as they go into this much wider world, the kingdom reborn. Behold, we make all things new. And you get that first breath and that the ecstasy of that. And that's, God willing, where we're headed.
I believe that that's what Gaia is doing right now. That she's going through and the interesting thing is, the midwife will always tell the mother, don't push when the contractions aren't happening, but when the contractions start, work with them. So if you try to, force it when there's no contractions, you're going to really hurt yourself. And if you ignore the contractions, you're going to hurt some more. So, wait till the contractions, cooperate with the contractions, stop when the contractions stop, and wait for the next set of contractions. And that's so the timing of the birth of what I call Homo spiritualis. We must look for when and where are the contractions. And how do we cooperate with them? And how do we learn to kind of back off at this stage, relax a little bit? There's no contractions happening right now. Wait for the next series and work with those. And finally, I think there's people like you then who are the doulas, the birth doulas, or the midwives, who are reaching hundreds of thousands of people and saying, guys, there is an opening. There's a beautiful world out there, but it involves, working with the contractions and say, here's how you work with the contractions. And you have a whole panoply of methodologies for that, whether it's plant medicine or it's dancing or it's poetry, or it's prayer or it's meditation, whatever it is, that there are lots of techniques out there that allow you to kind of work with the contractions and cooperate with them so that we can hasten the labor and lessen the pains.
Well said. Well said. All right. There's a question that I really want to ask you personally, and it's, of course, a very controversial question, but I think a person of your experience, and wisdom, I would love to get your opinion on it. And it's the opinion regarding abortion.
Yeah. Right. Sure.
This is because this is it's one that I wrestle with myself.
Yeah. I actually did a series of talks on it a month ago. Three different lectures on it, and I walked myself through it. And my kind of the progression for me is this: I first have to understand, what do I mean by life? What differentiates life from something else? So we have to have some criteria to establish the presence of life. The second one we have to establish is, what is the presence of human life? What differentiates human life from life? So what's the life of a kind of a mosquito, and what's the life of a human being? So that's the second kind of parsing we have to do. The third parsing for me is, when is a human life ensouled? When is an embryo ensouled? Does it begin at conception? Does it begin with the movement of the baby in the womb? Does it believe, some people would say, when the mother feels the baby moving? Does it is the baby ensouled only with the first breath? So there's a whole notion of, when is it ensouled? And then the fourth criterion for me is, when is it given personhood? And is personhood, is this a medical decision? Is it a political decision? Is it a moral decision, or is it a mystical decision? Who gets to decide who's a person? Because we've denied personhood throughout human history. Initially, the only persons were the kings, male kings. Nobody else was a person. They did not have personhood. And then at some stage, it was extended to all free males. They were regarded as persons. And then at some stage, freed slaves were offered personhood. And right down to our times, women were not regarded as persons. There were chattels, and kids were not regarded as persons. So at some stage, we're according them personhood. Does that make a difference? And so you had situations like, for instance, in South Africa in the 1840s, you had to get a hunting license to go after big game. And there's a report from the 1940s of a group of hunters going down there, and they're getting a permit, and the permit allows them to kill so many lions, so many, antelope, and 400 bushmen females. That was the license. You're allowed to kill 400 bushmen females. You had a situation in Tasmania, when the British conquered it, they didn't regard the natives as human beings. And so they wiped them out. And the last two Tasmanians were killed and sent to a taxidermist and stuffed and sent back to the museum in London. And they were there up to about 20 years ago when they were repatriated back to Tasmania. So they weren't persons. So the question then becomes, who's a person, and who gets to decide who a person is? So I went through that entire thing and looked at the progress from life to human life, to ensoulment, to personhood, and who gets to decide all of these stages. And then I wound up with, you have to realize then at different stages. Personally, I don't have any problem with women getting an abortion early on because of rape or incest, or for grave psychological or even financial reasons if it's early on. I have grave problems with the late-term abortions because I've actually read reports what happens. What happens with a late-term abortion at 8 or 9 months is that the abortionist goes in with a clamp, which has teeth on it, and she's casting about in the dark. There's no imaging. She can't see what she's going after. And she's going to try and grip something and pull it out. And it's not going to come out in one piece. An arm is going to come out, and she has to put it on the table. She goes back in. A leg comes out. She has to put it on the table. She goes back in and pulls, and the spinal column comes out. She goes back in, and she knows when she's got the head, because now a white liquid is going to ooze out from the womb. And she'll pull that out. And she has to reassemble all of the parts on the table to make sure that she got it all. Because if she leaves the part inside, the mother's going to have an infection. So she's to literally recreate the child on the table and then dump it. And in the meantime, the child at 8 months is struggling to avoid, this pencil strip. I have huge problems with the idea that you can go in as a human being and do that kind of torture to a child who's sentient and who recognizes the mother's voice and even the father's voice, and is doing somersaults of glee inside it, and that you can just extract it literally limb from limb. I got huge problems with that.
Of course.
That's why I walk them through the stages of, you decide when is life, when is human life, when is ensoulment happening, when is personhood accorded it, and at what stage of the process are you justified in literally tearing a child limb from limb and like creating a doll on the table to make sure you got all the pieces out.
Most, I think, sensible people think that it's just a matter of when.
Yeah.
And the time, there's a time. And some people are not. Some people are absolutists. There's no when. It's always life. There's no options, no situations, etc. But law has to come in and say this is legal and this is illegal. It's the purpose of law. Based on if someone just came to you and you had absolute authority to say, because of the people who have deep spiritual wisdom, I think it should be a council of people like yourself who should be the ones consulted for this decision making of the law. The mystics of both sexes and who've spent their life, studying these things. If you had to put that line somewhere, where would you put it?
Here's what I would go about it. So for me, I've mentioned a few of the facts and the kind of the ingredients of the decision-making process itself. There are 2 other pieces to the puzzle for me as well. I'm a really big believer that souls come in cohort groups, that we make what I call preconception contracts with each other, that in this coming incarnation, I'm going to be your father. In a previous incarnation, you were my brother, or you were my wife, or whatever. And so that we come in and I think we only know 3 things when we're coming in. We know the personal history of every other soul with whom we're going to be in significant contact. We know their performances in past incarnations, so we know what they're capable of, both the light and the dark. I know what I'm capable, given my past history, and I know what my purpose is. What are we coming in to do as a cohort group? What's my specific mission, this time as Sean? What is our mission as a group, as a nation, or as a culture, or whatever? What do we agree to do? And we come in, and then we face, that, situation is going to be modified by the decision-making of 8 billion different people. And so it's not like there's no plan, there's no script, there's no plot whatsoever. It's kind of, it's improv theater. It literally is improv theater.
Well said.
Yeah. I had a client one time who was a professional actor, and he especially was improv. He says there's 2 rules to improv theater. If you're on stage with another person, the 2 rules are, the first one is you have to work with any line your partner gives you. You can't say, that was a stupid thing to say. Give me another line. You can't work with that line. It's going to fall in his face. And the other rule he said is you got to feed your partner lines that play to his strengths, that are going to make him look good. Mm-hmm. And he's feeding you lines that play to your strength. Then the play is going to take off and going to be brilliant. So these are the 2 rules. So that's life. We come in with a preconception contract. I know this, the history of all the other guys I'm coming in with. I know my own history, what I'm capable of, good and bad, and I know what I'm signing up to do. But after that, there's no plot and there's no script. So now I'm going to have to kind of respond and react to what's happening around me. So at one stage now, I come in and I'm a woman. I find myself pregnant. This is part of a contract that I was to be the conduit for another soul to come in as my child. Am I kind of, at this stage, am I prepared to kind of annul that contract and say, okay, I'm taking a decision here that you're not coming through this way or this time. So, find somebody else or find some other. So that would be a fourth factor for me. And the 5th factor would be, and I'm not saying any one of these is the ultimate, it's a constellation of all these. The 5th factor for me would be then, what can I learn? What is this child actually capable of? What is it coming in to do? What is it contributing to the world? And I have no idea what it's going to be. Is this going to be the person who's going to turn out to be an avatar, or find a cure for cancer, or be an extraordinary athlete, or be a great preacher, or whatever it is? What is this child's mission coming in to do? And have I aborted that? And if there's like a lineup at the other side, there's only a certain number of human women on the planet at any one time who can be the conduits, for this process to take place. And there are gazillions of souls that I want to be on planet Earth. I want to be on planet Earth. It's like the boot camp of the galaxy. I want to shot at planet Earth. And you try and you get in there and somebody says, no, sorry, I'm going to cancel this trip. You have to wait for somebody else to kind of agree to be your passage through. So when I think about it, I factor in all these 5 pieces to it, and I would present all these 5 to the mother and the father, and I would say that there are 4 parties to the decision then. I call it AX1 plus BX2 plus CX3 plus DX4 equal the decision. X1 is the mother. And she's a major part in it, but not the totality. X2 is the father. Does the father want the child? Does he have any say in the abortion? If the mother decides I want an abortion and he doesn't, does he have any say? Or she wants to keep the baby and he wants to abort it, does he have any say? So X2 is the father. X3 is the child that's coming through. Does the child have any rights whatsoever? And X4 is society, because society has a duty to regulate kind of the moral behavior of its citizens. And since the child doesn't have a voice, the society has representing both the child and itself. And so I create this formula that AX1, A, B, C, and D are the weighting factors. And I would certainly weight the mother's kind of piece here more than any of the other 3 pieces, but not necessarily overriding all the other 3 pieces, depending on the circumstances. So I'd want to present them and say, okay, there are 4 parties to this decision. There's all this movement from life to human life to ensouled human life to personhood, to the fact that you made a preconception contract, to the fact that this child has a mission that you're now kind of aborting, and that this soul may have to wait 1,000,000 years on earth time to find somebody else. There's a vacancy available. So factor all those in. I know if it's within like 2 or 3 months, and there are grave medical or financial circumstances in attendant, or this the result of a rape or an incest, or there's grave mental health issues involved, I would say to you, having factored all this in, now make a decision, and whatever you come up with is the right decision.
Yeah. This is, and some part of me wants to push you to make that line, but I think what you're pointing to is actually more important, is that it's not so much about the line. There is a line somewhere, but it's really about conscientiously factoring all of these. And there should be, instead of just clinics that follow the law, there should be a process, and the process should have the elders who can lead somebody through this type of process and counseling, so that they can understand and really, really sit with all the factors before making a decision. Totally. And that seems like the evolved answer to this really impossible question.
And there'll be a different line for every person in every circumstance.
Right.
It's not like there's one line that one side fits all. You factor all these considerations in, and then to the best of your ability, you make the decision. It's interesting that even the Catholic Church claims, at least, whether or not they live it is another question, that the ultimate arbiter of our moral decision is conscience, but it has to be an informed conscience. That's the important piece. It has to be informed. You can't just say, I'm listening to my conscience, I'm going to do X. How informed is your conscience? How much do you understand? And not just about abortion. How much do you understand the issues involved in the decision you're about to make? Is it really informed, or is it just, this is what I want to do, and I'm going to pretend like I'm listening to my conscience? Mm-hmm. So there's work to be done by all parties to make sure that they have all pertinent data, and on the basis of the data, they're making a moral choice. Mm-hmm. And at that stage, I would say to you, okay, there's not a definite line that says this is the cutoff date.
Yeah. What about situations involving violence? So war.
Yes.
So this is one where you look at something like, you look at so many of the wars, and you're like, this is absurd and crazy that we're fighting in Vietnam, for example. Like, what the communists were going to come into our kitchen out of Laos, and no, they weren't. That was not going to happen. So. But then you look at something like World War II, and it's like, well, I think we got to storm the beaches of Normandy here. What's your view on that?
I got a lot of different kinds of input to it because it's a fascinating question. One of them is there was a cardinal in Chicago years ago called Cardinal Bernardine. He talked about this seamless garment approach to moral choices around taking life. So he says, you can't have one kind of set of rules for abortion, another set for executions, another set for self-defense, another set for war. You have to have some metric whereby you can evaluate all situations in which you're going to take a human life, and make decisions which are consistent throughout. So there can't be totally different sets of criteria to establish one from the other. So that's the first thing I would say about it. The second thing is, I don't believe in violence, but I do believe in self-defense. I know, for instance, that my soulmate, who lives half a mile from me, if her life was in danger, I'd kill the bastard who was going to kill her. Mm-hmm. I've no doubt that I would. Mm-hmm. I don't own a gun. I've never owned a gun. But my only choice to save her life was to kill the would-be murderer. I'd kill him. Mm-hmm. Now, I think you can extend that to kind of the life of a community or even a nation. Now, I'm putting myself in kind of jeopardy here, but I am really, really pro-Israel. I've always been. I think that Israel has conducted itself in an extraordinarily moral fashion, going back to the 1948, it's declared, a state in March of 1948. Immediately 5 Arab armies attacked them. It happens again in 67, happens again in 73, happens in October 7 with the massacre of 1,200 people at a party, and the abduction of another 251 and torturing them, beheading little kids with shovels, taking photographs of it. I think a culture has not only the right, but the duty to defend itself against that kind of barbarity. That's the second consideration. A third consideration is that behind all that, there are financial forces which are bankrolling all kinds of warfare and
That's for sure.
Yeah. So how do you differentiate between wars which are just bankrolling, the oligarchy, and are creating situations where they're putting people fighting each other? How do you participate in that kind of thing? And that's totally evil as far as I'm concerned. So establishing who's actually calling the shots and, creating these scenarios in which they're forcing people to fight each other, and that making war on those people. And I don't mean just assassinate them. I mean calling them out and showing them exactly the shit that they've perpetrated on the planet, as long as Homo sapiens sapiens has been around. So they'd be kind of the 3 major considerations that I would think about when it comes to violence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. This is the necessity of having, the archetype of the good king.
Exactly.
And the good king whose heart is wide open and who's, a philosopher king, someone who really understands and feels. And I think it's also someone who's deeply connected to God and understands that God is in all living things and all creatures and all beings and omniconsiderate to all. And the good king is the one who serves as purely, the good of all, but has to make impossible decisions all the time because things are messy and it's not always clear. The formula doesn't always spit out a clear answer. At some point, the good king, whoever that is, a group of people, whatever's in that archetype, has to make a decision.
Absolutely.
And those decisions can be really difficult to live with.
Yeah. Absolutely. Right on. And so for me, then it's about a total revisitation of the ways in which we're doing life on planet Earth. So I go back again to my friend that I met down at the river. And one of the things he said to me, he said, after he said, once we introduce free will into the equation, all bets are off. And then he said, I can tell you, your civilization, planet Earth, is at a trifurcation point. There are 3 versions of you coming to the future. He said the first one, he called it Homo sociopathicus, an oligarchy who just see other human beings as resources to be employed for their benefit, whether that's, the physical resources of the planet or the human resources of the planet, and you're just peons in their game. That's Homo sociopathicus. That's the first line. The second one he called Homo artificialis. He said they're going to create a slave race, whether you call them robotic or transhuman or whatever you're going to call them, who are going to be both programmable and hackable. And they will do the bidding of Homo sociopathicus. And the third group he called Homo spiritualis. And they're the ones who are waking up who realize that they're bite-sized pieces of God, they're fractals of the divine, and that everybody else, even the bad guys, are fractals of the divine. And your job is to make sure that you don't become homo artificialis and you stand up to homo sociopathicus and you call them out. And you create a movement so that the next stage of humanity is homo spiritualis, leading to homo mysticus, leading to homo Christus, where we realize that ultimately there is only God. And each of us is here on behalf of that divine source.
Well, sounds like a battle cry to me.
Yeah, it is. We're warriors on the way.
Yeah.
I had that interesting, I see it in my dreams quite a lot. So I'm the spiritual director and a co-founder of a group called Companions on the Journey. We've been together now 27 years. So I'm their spiritual director. And sometime about a year ago, I had a dream, and in this dream, I'm visiting a Protestant church, and I'm in the congregation, and I'm listening to this young pastor, and he's giving a drosh, and he's giving this really, really great homily, and I'm really amazed at his kind of erudition and his kind of articulation. So I go around to the back of the church to meet him when the service is finished, and he comes out from the back of the church, and I say, "Hi, I just wanted to congratulate you on this extraordinary performance." I wanted to say to him, "I'm the spiritual director for a small group called Companions on the Journey." I couldn't remember the name of the organization. So what I said in the dream was, "I'm the spiritual director for a small group called Warriors on the Way." And I woke up with that burning in my mind. I said, "Okay, that's what you're part of, Warriors on the Way. That's your job. Become part of the group who are Warriors on the Way. Find the other light workers and join with them. That's your function." Yeah.
I'm glad that I found you, and I'm glad that our audience has found you as well. We're going to be back again tomorrow morning to cover so much more other things, and we're going to have another podcast together. But it's been such a delight, and thank you for showing me your sacred tree.
It's been a privilege just to bathe in your energy, not just your conversation and your kind of your erudition and your knowledge and your breadth of kind of experiences, Aubrey, but just to feel your energy. I'm very particular about whom I invite and allow into this space. I don't want to contaminate it by assholes.
I understand. I understand.
Right.
I passed the asshole test.
You passed the asshole test.
Right. Well, we're getting somewhere. That's good. That was good. I'll put that one in my bag. Thank you so much.
A million thanks for your crew. Amazing guys.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody. We love you.
Amen to that.
Thanks for tuning into this video. Make sure you hit subscribe. Follow me at Aubrey Marcus. Check out the Aubrey Marcus podcast, available everywhere. And leave a comment. Let me know if this video resonated or what else you would like to hear from me in the future. Thank you so much.